Bret Hart's name is synonymous with excellence in the ring, but being the hitman wasn't just about technical ability, it also meant sticking to his principles. Bret built a reputation for being uncompromising, and when someone didn't measure up or crossed a line, Bret wasn't shy about letting them know. Throughout his legendary career, there were a few wrestlers that Bret simply couldn't stand to work with, and in today's video we're taking a look at who those wrestlers were. Take Tom Magee for example. Magee was a physical specimen who seemed destined for greatness in the WWF. With his incredible physique, many thought that he was going to be the next big thing, someone who could potentially fill the shoes of Hulk Hogan. Vince McMahon believed that this man would be a future WWF champion. He was placed in a match with Bret, and on the night, Bret did his best to work with him and tried to make him look like a star. In fact, he made him look like $1 million, so much so that everyone backstage was convinced that he was their next megastar. When I came back through the curtain, Vince and Pat had swarmed all over Magee. Afterwards, it was Tom who told me that Vince nearly wet his pants while watching the TV monitor as he exclaimed, loud enough for all to hear, "That's my next champion." Vince seemed to think that Magee did it on his own. Bret just couldn't believe that Vince McMahon and Pat Patterson, two of the greatest minds in wrestling, couldn't see that it was he who'd made this useless musclehead look good. And while Bret's frustrations with Magee came from his lack of experience, his issues with Dino Bravo were a bit different. Bravo was a seasoned veteran by the time he crossed paths with Bret, but despite his years in the business, he still managed to test his patience. Bravo was known for his incredible strength, but Bret found him to be lacking in the work ethic department. He said that Bravo was lazy in the ring, relying more on his look and his power. It's not as though Dino Bravo was that bad, but he sure wasn't great. He looked sluggish, had no personality, and was a so-so worker at best. And thanks to his careless attitude, Bravo ended up badly hurting Bret during a match in 1989. Bravo catapulted Bret off the apron and into the steel railing on the floor, where he ended up with a fractured sternum, 5 cracked ribs, and a bruised heart. He was out of action for several months, recovering from the injury, and while Bravo would eventually fade into the background in the early 90s, Bret continued to rise up the ranks in the Federation, and that included a feud with Ric Flair. Of course, Flair is considered to be one of the greatest of all time, a legend with a career spanning decades, but when it came to Bret Hart, their in-ring chemistry was far from legendary. In fact, Bret has been very vocal about his dislike for Flair's style and their lackluster matches together. Flair was what my dad called a routine man because he did the same match every night, no matter who he worked with. He also liked to call every step of the match with little input from me. Their differences became even more apparent when Bret won his first WWF Championship from Flair in 1992. While the match should have been a huge moment in Bret's career, he's always been disappointed with how it went down. He believes that Flair failed to put a decent amount of effort into the match, and he felt disrespected by that. Bret has always called Flair overrated, pointing out that while Flair's reputation might have been legendary, his actual in-ring work didn't live up to the hype. But Flair wasn't the only legend that Bret took issue with during the early 90s. It was around 1993 and Hulk Hogan's star had already started to fade. The WWF was looking to transition to a younger crop of talent. Bret was positioned to take the reins, but Hogan wasn't quite ready to let go of the spotlight, and this led to one of the most frustrating moments in Bret's career. The tensions between Bret and Hogan came to a head at WrestleMania 9. the main event was between Bret and Yokozuna for the WWF Championship, and the Hitman expected to retain his title. But on the day, Vince McMahon had a change of heart. Instead, Yoko was going to beat him to become the new champion, and then Hogan was going to come down and save the day, beating him in an impromptu match. And that's exactly what happened, with Hogan walking out of WrestleMania as the new world champion. It later turned out that Hogan had been in McMahon's ear all along and got him to change the outcome of the match. I couldn't help but stare at the TV monitor, watching Hogan work the crowd with the same old posing routine, a hand behind the ear, shaking the world belt in the air as if to say it belonged to him all along. A few minutes later, Hogan came up to me excited and happy and said, "Thank you, brother, I won't forget it. I'll be happy to return the favour." I looked my old friend in the eye and said, "I'm going to remember that, Terry." But Hogan never did repay Bret for the favour. In fact, he refused to drop the title to Bret at the King of the Ring a few months later. Hogan told Vince McMahon that he didn't think that Bret was in the same league as him. Once Hogan got back to his dressing room, I knocked on the door and stepped in. Jimmy Hart, Dave Hebner and Beefcake were with him. I said, "Terry, I want to speak with you." We stared at each other. "You told me at WrestleMania 9 that you'd be happy to return the favour, and as I understand it, now you don't want to even work with me, you won't put me over, and I'm not in your league." Hogan stood there speechless, so I carried on. "Well, you're right, you're not in my league. On behalf of myself, my family, and most of the boys in the dressing room, you can go fuck yourself." The situation just cemented Bret's belief that Hogan was a self-serving, lying and untrustworthy character in the wrestling business. In recent years, Bret has often attacked Hogan via social media and in interviews, never afraid to speak his mind about the Hulkster. As the 90s progressed, a new generation of wrestlers began to take the spotlight in the WWF, and at the forefront of that was Shawn Michaels. What started as a professional rivalry quickly descended into one of the most bitter and personal feuds in wrestling history. And at first, there was some mutual respect between the men, but as their careers progressed, so did the tension between them. Bret was very respectful and almost old-fashioned in his ways, while Shawn had a rebellious, bad attitude. The cracks in their relationship began to show when they were booked to face each other at WrestleMania 12 in an Iron Man match for the WWF Championship. While the match itself is now legendary, the backstage tension between the men was almost unbearable. Bret always admitted that Shawn was incredibly talented, but his attitude made him difficult to work with. He was more concerned with getting his own way and making himself look good, usually at the expense of everyone else around him. The animosity between them only grew from there, especially as Shawn started to overtake Bret in terms of popularity. Bret felt that Shawn's unprofessional behaviour backstage was disrespectful, not just to him but to the business as a whole. Their rivalry reached its boiling point in 1997, leading to one of the most controversial moments in wrestling history, the Montreal Screwjob. Bret was set to leave the company and go to WCW, and he was supposed to drop the WWF Championship to Shawn, but he wanted to do it on his own terms. But what happened instead was a betrayal that Bret would never forget. After the Montreal Screwjob, Bret left the WWF feeling betrayed and hurt by everyone involved, not least Shawn Michaels. He went to WCW hoping for a fresh start, but instead found himself facing someone that would ultimately end his in-ring career. Enter Bill Goldberg. The moment came at Starrcade in December 1999 when Bret and Goldberg faced off for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. During the match, Goldberg delivered a stiff kick to Bret's head, causing a severe concussion. The damage was so severe that he was forced to retire from professional wrestling not long after. Many fans have never forgiven Goldberg for this reckless moment, and Bret himself certainly hasn't either. I would hurt myself before I ever hurt another wrestler. I just wish some of the wrestlers that I worked with, especially at the end, like Goldberg to me was one of the most unprofessional wrestlers that ever was in the business. I mean, to get Bill Goldberg to be in the Hall of Fame, he hurt everybody he worked with. You might as well wrestle a real gorilla. The aftermath of that kick left Bret dealing with post-concussion syndrome, and he had to live with the reality that his wrestling days were over, and the bitterness towards Goldberg has stayed with him ever since.